All right, so let's just take a look at what we've got. You've got your piece 14, or some of the other pattern numbers, it might be like 15 and 16. There's different numbers on them. But what's important is that you have a back piece and you have a front piece. And for both of them, it says to cut 2. So that's what we've done. We've cut through 2 layers. You've got your 2 pieces of your back of your shorts and your 2 pieces of your front. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take all the pins out of each of the patterns. I'm going to then fold the pattern pieces neatly and put them back in the envelope. And in class, you'll have a binder that those get stored in. But this pattern can be used over and over again, so it's really important to take good care of them and to try not to tear them, and just keep them nice so that we can reuse them over and over again. So I'll take those and store them away. All right, and now we're ready for our first step. So I've got my 2 sets here. This is my back, this is my front. I'm going to take a piece from the back, so I'm going to take the one right off the top, and then the side over on my front. And I'm going to lay them with right sides together. So I've got right sides together, and I'm going to match them up at the notch right there. So this is like the inner leg seam. I'll line those up. Then I want to make sure that the fabric itself on the cut edge, or the raw edge right there, that it is lined up really, really well. Because when I'm sewing my seam, we're actually going to do a 1/4 of an inch seam, which is a rather small seam allowance. So we don't want the edges to be off at all, because then when you're sewing, you could miss stitching. So I want to make sure that they're perfectly lined up. Okay, all the way down. And then we're going to do that same thing. So I'm just going to get it pinned in that one place on the other 2 pieces. So again, I'll put those right sides together. On the inner leg, I'm going to pin straight down, matching up at the triangle notches. All right, so this is what you should have right now. You should have 2 pieces that look just like that. We've got our back and our front pinned together at the inner leg. And now we're ready to sew a 1/4 of an inch seam. All right, we're gonna take our seam gauge and we're gonna move it to a 1/4 of an inch. So we're looking at the top line, top row of lines. That would be 1/8. And the second line over is 2/8, which would be 1/4 of an inch. So we're at a 1/4 of an inch. And then I'm just gonna hold my seam gauge down next to my seam and measure it. So I'm right at a 1/4 of an inch. That's where I want to be. I want you to measure yours and make sure you are doing it correctly before you actually move on to sew the shorts. What I'm trying to show you here is where the fabric is lined up. So when I'm on a stitch selection of 1, I want the edge of my fabric lined up with this line on the presser foot. So in the back of the presser foot, there's these little grooves, these little indentions. That's what my fabric is lined up with. There is also a gauge on the back of the throat plate that says a 1/4 of an inch. So you can look at either of those things to get that perfect 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So before you get started on your shorts, you'll practice on a scrap. I've folded the edge under, so I have a nice straight side to line up with that point on my presser foot. So I'm going to practice doing a seam, and then I'll measure it to make sure I'm right on. So one last time, I just want to show you what it's going to look like. I've got my fabric for my shorts lined up with my indention on the presser foot. I'm at a stitch selection of 1, and so I'm going to have a 1/4 of an inch seam. I want to make sure that I have a 2.5 stitch length, and I'm going to back stitch when I start and when I stop. And I'm not going to run over my pins. I'm going to pull those out as I come to them. All right, we've completed the first step of sewing. So we have stitched a 1/4 of an inch seam on the inner leg. And now you have a choice. You may either go to the serger, which is the recommended step, and serge along this edge so that you will have a nice finished edge. It'll look more professional, kind of like something that you bought from a store. Or you can do a overcast stitch on your sewing machine. So when you do the overcast stitch, you will want to get out a G foot. That's the foot that has the little hook underneath the bottom. And then you will turn to stitch 9. And so for that one, it's going to stitch along the edge as well. It's going to finish it. It's just not as fast. A serger, you can zip down those seams really, really quickly. With the overcast stitches, it takes a little bit longer. If you're going to do the overcast stitch on your machine, you could go in right now and trim off your triangle notches. If you're using the serger, when you are serging, it will cut those off for you. Alright, because I'm sewing this at home and I don't have a serger at my house, I went ahead and put that G foot on, and on my stitch selector I've turned it to stitch 9 and I've increased the stitch length to a 4. The 5 stitch width was the automatic one that popped up, and so I'm going to leave that the same. So you'll want to make sure that you do increase that. And then what you're looking for here is you're going to line the edge of your fabric up with the opening in the foot, so it keeps that fabric lined up with that opening the whole time. And so as you are stitching down, the needle's going to do a lot of moving for you. All you have to worry about doing is keeping the opening of the presser foot in line with the edge of your fabric. Okay. Alright, so I finished with my overcast stitch. That's just finished the edges here. And so the fabric will unravel. It's just a finishing stitch. Now we need to line up the circular part. So this one, you're going to need your pins handy. Again, we're going to go right sides together. So you're going to open up one of your pieces and just lay it down like this. You want to take this over to the iron and press it. And you want to take this piece over to the iron and press it open like that. But they're going to lay right sides together just like this. You're going to line up the notch here. You're going to line up at the crotch. You'll have one of your seams going to the left and the other one going to the right, but you want that stitch to be lined up perfectly. And then you'll line up at your notches over here. Okay, so you've got 3 main places that you line up, and then you're going to pin all the way around. So I'll do that next. All right, so I've got it all pinned. You may notice at this point, they really don't look like shorts at all, and that's okay. You'll see them start changing shape as we put the rest of the pattern pieces together. So next step, you're gonna sew from here. So we'll do a 1/4 of an inch seam again, the same seam allowance we did on these 2 seams. You're gonna do it going all the way around till you get to the other side, and then you'll back stitch where you start and where you're gonna stop, and then you'll also either serge or do the overcast stitch again. If you've just previously done the overcast stitch on the seams, you'll want to make sure to switch your foot back to a J foot and back to a stitch 1 for your 1/4 of an inch seam. If you had used the serger, then you won't have to worry about it. Your setting should still be the same if you're just picking up where you left off. All right, I've just done my 1/4 of an inch seam, and I just want to show you that again, if you are not using the serger, which I would recommend because it is faster, but if you're not, that at this point you can go in and you can trim off your triangle notches, and then you're going to go back either to the serger. Well, I guess if you just trim those off, you're not going to do the serger. You're going to go back to your machine, put the G foot back on, change back to stitch 9, and then you're going to increase that stitch length to a 4 like we did previously, and you're going to put that overcast stitch all the way around. Okay. All right, so I've just done the overcast stitch right here on the curve. Now the next thing you're going to do is you're going to take these 2 pieces like this. So we're going to open it up, open this piece up like that. Okay, and then you're going to fold them this direction. So now you're bringing the sides together. So I've got a notch here and a notch there. I'm going to line those up. Got some threads hanging there. I'm gonna line those up and pin down this side, and then I will do the same thing to this side. And I don't know if you can tell, but they're starting to look like shorts. So they're finally starting to resemble something you could wear. So here's the leg holes, and then here's the waistband. It doesn't have a casing yet or anything like that, but it is starting to look like a pair of shorts. Okay, so we'll pin down the side of both of the legs. All right, so I have pinned down both sides of the legs. Now we're ready to sew. We're using a 1/4 of an inch seam. Again, same exact seam allowance and same seam finish that we've done on all of the other seams so far. All right, previously I had said that you would go ahead and finish the seam just like you had earlier, and you will. But what you are gonna do first is you're gonna take your shorts and you're gonna go try them on. That way, if they are really, really too big, you could adjust your seam allowance. If they're really, really too small, we may be in trouble and you might be making these for a friend. But if they are way too big, now obviously they're going to be too big up here around the waist because we haven't made the casing, we haven't put in the elastic yet. So where you're wanting to fit through is like through the hips. If that is just really, really loose through the hip and through your rear end, and also in the thighs, if they're just really, really a lot looser than you had hoped that they would be, what you could then do is you could go back and put in a new seam allowance. So I've got a 1/4 of an inch seam. Maybe I go ahead and do one that's another 5/8 over from that. So I'm going to be reducing the seam allowance by an additional 5/8 on each side. Maybe it's not quite that large. Maybe I just take my seam in another 1/4 of an inch. So instead of having a 1/4 of an inch inseam, it would be a 1/2. So you'll have to kind of work with what, maybe not guessing, but I'll work with you in class to try to figure out exactly how much more you would need to take off. But you want to do that before you finished your seam, because then what you would end up doing is cutting that seam finish off if you end up moving the spot of the seam allowance. Okay, so that should be what you do next. Try them on, make sure they fit, and then once they do, then you will finish the seam with a serger or the overcast stitch on right over here, the overcast stitch on your sewing machine.